Welcome to the Measure Success podcast, where we talk with top leaders about effective strategies that inspire success. We just got to have a little shout out to start out with. We're very excited. We were just selected as the number 4 top strategic planning podcast in the world, I believe, the way how the ratings were set. And so anyways, very excited about that. Thank you so much for those ratings that we received. And thank you very much for the accolades the process behind that. Excited to have with us Michael Erath. He is a lifelong entrepreneur and the founder of Next Level Growth, a firm dedicated to helping entrepreneurial leaders build elite organizations and achieve not just a strong return on investment, but also, I love this, a meaningful return on life. That's why you're on the show here, Michael. With over 20 years experience, he has a unique user-focused approach to business growth. And it stands apart from traditional one-size-fits-all. But what I also love about his experiences, he's actually hit top and he's hit the bottom. And he has some stories. And we're actually going to lead off with that. I asked Michael if it's okay to talk about that, because it definitely was a semblance of his life of having this great business that ultimately the financial crisis and fraud killed it, basically, really devastated what happened. So Michael, once again, welcome to the Measure Success podcast.
Carl, I appreciate it. And congratulations also on the accolades. I've listened to several of your podcasts. They are well-deserved.
Thank you. Very kind of you saying that. So let's just hit it right into here. Michael, tell us about how things started out. You had a successful business going, and what happened?
Yeah, so I grew up in a family manufacturing business. So our facilities were in Virginia, in the western part of the state, and our sales offices were in North Carolina. We were in the hardwood veneer industry. So we manufactured hardwood veneer for the furniture industry. And I kind of worked all through high school and college, like a lot of kids in family businesses, and decided in college that was the route that I definitely wanted to go. So my father was 44 years older than me. So when I got out of college and started working full time, he was getting to that age where he was wanting to slow down and start enjoying himself. And so I ended up I was about 26 when I became president of the company, which in hindsight was premature, but I had been in the business for quite a while. But one of our challenges, we were about an $8 million company. We were almost 100% domestic with our sales. And one of the early challenges I faced was that our customers all started moving their production offshore, primarily to China, then Vietnam, and eventually Southeast Asia. So as I was coming in, we had to pivot from a domestic supplier to an international company. And we had a second issue that I needed to overcome. I had joined YPO in my early 30s, and several of my formates in YPO had vertically integrated portions of their business. And so we were struggling to source enough of the raw material in the qualities we needed. So I wanted to vertically integrate and get closer to our timber source. So I brought on a partner and created a subsidiary business that focused on timber merchandising. So we started buying standing timber. We got very, very close to the natural resource. And he and the subsidiary we started would merchandise everything that we did not want to produce. We would keep the best logs, produce them, and have them at a lower cost. So that worked really well for a number of years. We ended up scaling the business from 8 to 45 million. We had around 70 employees when I started. We had 200 by 2008, and we were shipping about 200 containers a month. We had sales offices on 6 continents. So we'd gone through a lot of growth. But my partner and I had become best friends. I ended up becoming his son's godfather. We vacationed a lot together with our families, and we were just very, very close. So in 2008, in November, I got a phone call from my CFO, and he let me know that he was confident he had uncovered that my partner had not only embezzled over $500,000 in about an 18-month time frame, but was committing bank fraud. So we were tied very closely to the housing market, and 2007 was the best year we had had. And I had and I write about this in my first book, Rise. I had all the trappings of success, right? We had a King Air. I was a pilot. I was flying us around everywhere, raced in Porsche Club and did all that stuff that a lot of times business owners do when they reach a level of success. But we got to this point, revenues were declining. I had kind of taken my eye off the ball on a couple of things, and I was hit with his fraud and embezzlement. And so we lawyered up. We brought in a former FBI forensic accountant that had a private practice doing forensic accounting. He worked with my CFO, and we found out that he had, in fact, not only embezzled over $500,000, but he had started signing falsified borrowing base certificates to a federally chartered bank. So when we put all the evidence together of what we had found, it took about 3 days. I had the distinct honor of one particular day going not only to the U.S. Attorney's office with our team, but also to the bank and letting them know what we had uncovered. So, of course, the bank immediately froze all of our accounts and went into protect mode. By this point in time, we had transacted my mother out of the business. My father had passed. He passed in '03. So my mother's no longer a shareholder, but about a year before this, I had expanded our production facility and took out a $6 million term note. She and my wife and I were all still stuck on that guarantee. So now we become illiquid overnight. We're facing my partner's crimes, and I had to figure out how to protect my mother and also my wife and I to the best of our abilities. So we were in our we were 37 at this time. And the one piece of leverage I had going into this with the bank was, if you remember, late 2008, everybody in trouble was given the keys to the bank and letting attorneys fight it out. So the special assets groups were flooded with all of these problems to deal with that they weren't accustomed to. So that actually became my opportunity. We owed the bank enough money and we were in such a niche industry. If they had forced us into bankruptcy and just liquidated things at auction, they would have recovered close to zero because there would just be no market. So I offered to not throw the keys at them and walk away if they would give me just enough liquidity to keep the doors open and walk the company through an orderly liquidation. And I didn't know how long it would take, but I knew I could recover significantly more for the bank and for the creditors than if we threw it into bankruptcy. And that allowed me to protect my mother. It allowed my wife and I to maintain our credit and deal with this outside of bankruptcy. And I had a few really, in hindsight, a few really fortunate events happen that allowed me to eventually get the bank made whole. I got the creditors made whole, and my wife and I took the haircut. But it allowed us to keep the equity in our home. It allowed us to keep our credit intact and live to fight another day, which was really our mantra through that whole period. It took about 4 years in total for my partner to finally be prosecuted and spend 2 years in federal prison. But that allowed us to transition, start a new business on the heels of that. We moved from Virginia to Ohio. There was a contract manufacturer in Ohio producing hardwood veneer. So we kept 2 key employees, one log buyer, one salesperson, my wife and I, and basically restarted from scratch.
Wow.
That business we built to about 7 million before I exited that and decided I wanted to transition into coaching and consulting to help other entrepreneurs avoid some of the things and learn some of the lessons that I learned through me, not through trial and error.
That's a remarkable story, first of all. I remember we had an organization I was with, and we have more success stories than bad stories, so to speak. But I remember being on the phone with the special access division of a major bank, and we had already done all the work. We had already had the layoffs. We'd already actually had enough cash to pay off the debt. They had well, I won't use which words I want to use here, but basically said, "What are you going to do for the bank?" And I was like, "You kidding me? We've already fixed things." But obviously, they have a certain role is to get rid of you when you get to that point. And so I was like, "Hey, well, the good news for us is we already had multiple banks lined up and we're ready to go." But that process was painful, right?
Absolutely.
But you add on top of it, you had major downfall in your industry. I mean, you in particular, how selling furniture, new housing, really bad, right? That all goes away. You add on to it the fraud. What was going on in your soul? I mean, I just can't imagine that phone call when you uncovered and learned that here one of your best friends commits fraud.
Right.
What was that conversation like?
So yeah, my CFO called me, and I was in YPO, as I mentioned at the time, and it was my year to moderate our forum the upcoming years. Forum groups are small subgroups within the community. So I was driving to Washington D.C. to go through my forum moderator training course. It was that particular weekend, and I was only about an hour outside of D.C. We lived in Roanoke, Virginia, and that's when I got the call from Bob. And it was a short call. I could hear in his voice something was really wrong. Called our attorney as soon as I got off the phone with Bob. Nick was a good friend of ours and our business attorney. He said, if there's any truth to it, you need to cancel your plans, turn around and come back. So we met, I don't know, it was probably 9 o'clock at night. I got back to Nick's house. Bob met us there. Nick was kind enough to open a really nice bottle of wine, and we we spent a couple hours that night unpacking what Bob had discovered. And it was through Nick that we got connected with the forensic accountant and started putting everything together. But it was, yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that just rocks you to a world. It's almost like hearing of an unexpected death in terms of just how it hits. But it was something where, and I don't know specifically where it comes from, but my wife and I just really took this live to fight another day attitude. The first couple of weeks were just shell shock. But once we started to get our legs back under us, it was really just about how do we live to fight another day.
And good for you for making it through as a marriage perspective, right? Because that is a lot of stress. Here you're protecting your mom,
Sure.
going through that, and you're losing everything else around it. And then there's just this, regardless if you did things right or wrong, there's this, it breaks your soul a bit, right? Because your ego and everything in it is in your business and what you've done. And you described it, you're in the Porsche Club, you're flying around planes. That goes away, right?
Very fast. And it's interesting you bring that up. I actually haven't talked about this a lot on any podcast I've done since the new book came out. But in my first book, there's an entire chapter about my relationship with my wife. So just I'll quickly digress into that because she and I actually met when we were 4. We met in preschool, started dating at 15, got married at 22, had our first child at 24. So by the time we're going through this in our late 30s, we'd basically done our entire lives together. But there was also something that was still a bit sophomoric about our relationship because we had done it all together, right? And I was allowing my ego to be and my personality to be too much in a lot of ways. And she's very much a pleaser and a quiet, reserved person. So what I realized in hindsight was she was absorbing a lot of my personality without me knowing it, and it was causing her to build a wall. And what was really interesting, and this is kind of how I write this 4th chapter in the book, but we went through, and this was in August of 2008, we went through a really rough, very short, but very rough patch in our marriage, where we actually got to the point where I moved out for about a month. And through counseling with our pastor, through a marriage counselor we started working with, in October, I moved back in and we had figured out a path forward and how to better work together. And in November is when I found out about my partner's fraud. And to this day, I believe this is one of those circumstances where God allowed a trial in our life to force us to fix something that, had it not been fixed, what we were about to go through would have destroyed our family. And so that's just something that I really just come back to that I find very grounding. But it's one of those things where, you can't connect the dots looking forward, but when you look backwards, you can really start to see how the dots connect.
Wow, amen on that, right? That challenge, and I mean, that's the raw part, right? These what many people don't know is growing a business successfully and growing. You have to deal with your own ego, right? A lot, right? Getting through that, but there's also the perception that from the outside world that everything must be going great,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
And the reality is, we're human, just like anybody else, and we have our own problems. We have our own challenges we have, and even sometimes, yeah, it's interesting. My wife and I hadn't got together as early um, as you all. We started dating at 16, but married at 22, first kid at
Okay.
24, first of 4 kids, and kind of very similar from that perspective. But yeah, we've had a couple times too, and it's been very business related of like this. Where do we go next, right? And how do we get alignment where we have real conflict, what's taking place? And these are hard things because when you feel so passionate, I'm sure like you have, about what you're doing, your business, and you're helping to provide for other families, not just for
Right.
yourself. Yeah, but it's good for you once again that you were able to get through and build another business and then get to what you're doing today to help other businesses out. And I think I could imagine for yourself, it just gives so much more credibility, right? When working with others because you've actually done it before. And that's the thing that, we were talking briefly about is I think some of the challenges in the consulting world is life. And this is going to lead to our next discussion about your new book. Five sessions will lead organizations. Things aren't generally a prescription. It's not A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. What we like to say in strategic planning is a hypothesis fact. You don't know until you get in the grit. These ideas you put on a whiteboard, actually, will they work when you go into actually getting things done? And so that's why principle-based things typically are so much more effective. And that's what you've helped put together in 5 obsessions of elite organizations. So let's get into that. I know it's a little bit why you wrote it, but tell us more. I mean, what
Yeah.
drove you to write your third book?
Sure. So really, kind of the journey from the systemization of business lens. When I had our manufacturing business in Virginia, and I was in YPO, the form group that I was in, I see you have a copy of Good to Great behind you. We went through Good to Great together. There were so many wonderful concepts in that book, but there's not a roadmap. Here's how you can figure that out and do it in your business. And so our form group got really intentional about working together to figure out in each of our businesses, what was the profit per X? How can we use that as an analytical tool to make better decisions and decisions that will drive our economics? We studied Mastering the Rockefeller Habits, which was the precursor to scaling up. We went through top grading together, which I adopted the lion's share of top grading in the business. And so I had started to cobble together bits and pieces of different systems. We used some of the meeting structures from Rockefeller Habits. And so when I got to the second business when we were in Ohio, I had transitioned to EO, the Entrepreneurs Organization, and the form group I was in there went through the book Traction by Gino Wickman. And that's about the entrepreneurial operating system. And so what interested me there was, unlike what I had been able to do, what Gino explained really is kind of getting your arms around all of these different concepts. And so I started down the path of self-implementing EOS into our business. But as I was doing it, there were certain tools that were kind of the prescribed EOS tools that, for my business and my culture and just the way I am wired, they didn't seem like a great fit. So I went back to other systems. I'd studied other thought leaders, and I would either leverage a different tool that accomplished the same thing, or I would really kind of modify and create my own way of doing it. Again, accomplishing the objective or the intent, but with a different tool. And so when I exited that business in 2015, I decided to become an EOS implementer. I did that for a little over 5 years. And I had tremendous success early on, in part because of my background and my backstory. The entrepreneurs that I was talking to wanted to work with somebody who had had their teeth kicked in and been through the things I had been through. But at the time, we were under a license agreement as EOS implementers. So they could tell us we needed to be pure, but they couldn't control that. And so I was teaching clients EOS with lots of other things, and we were very, very hybrid in the way we did things. And it was very successful. But then when Gino sold to private equity, the private equity firm decided they would benefit from becoming a franchise, which they did. And the franchise agreements became much more restrictive on the franchisees. So that was when I walked away. We just were misaligned at that point. And it was the right move, I think, for the for the private equity group. But for me, it would devalue me as a business coach to say, well, gosh, you can only teach 20 tools, you can only teach this thing. And what I started to really realize as I was going through that breakup and starting my own thing was that these prescriptive systems by design put primacy on the system over the user, and they make it more about the system than about the user. And I can't tell you how many people I have heard that have tried EOS or tried scaling up, and that's been the ultimate result. And so what I really wanted to focus on is what are the underlying principles that are core to truly elite organizations. And I wanted to see, like, does this hold true in for-profit, not-for-profit sports organizations that have become dynasties? Like, is this translatable, and is it really, really true? And that's where we got to these 5 obsessions. And the concept of elite comes from a video I saw of Nick Saban giving a talk. And this is on our YouTube page. It's less than a minute long. But he talks about 5 choices that we all have in life. And he says, we can choose, number 1, to be bad at what we do. And some people, unfortunately, do that. We can choose to be average, or we can choose to be good. And he said, being good is probably about God's expectation for whatever talent he gave us or gifts he gave us. But he said, you can also choose to be excellent or elite. But if you choose to be excellent or elite, you have to have a special discipline, a special drive and focus and passion to do things to a high standard all of the time, or you probably never get past good. And there was something about that idea of really elite and what that looked like and what that meant that resonated with me. And I really started to focus on, of the companies I've worked with, of the people I've been around that have done like category of one stuff, or that have just done fantastic things, what underlies that? And that's where we got to these 5 obsessions that I write about in the book.
That's a good backdrop. And I really appreciate, once again, and I think you and I both know EOS is incredible organization. They're
Yeah, and it was
doing
very good to me in the time I was with it.
exactly. It's an amazing organization. Gino Wickman's a genius and made a brilliant decision to ultimately go PE to expand it. And you and I both know this. I mean, there's 33 million small businesses, and getting something better than nothing is far better,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
And so I'm a big fan of, hey, let's get stuff out there. But there is a point where the tool doesn't work because we're not thinking, right? One of my favorite books is The Goal by Elijah Goldratt, and he wrote a second book, It's Not Luck, because he got so frustrated because people were just trying to focus on the bottlenecks. He's like, no, 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 you got to think. This is about a
Right.
thinking process, right? Which you could apply in any situation. And that's where you are heading towards, right, with your book is once again these principles you can apply. So let's start going into these obsessions. Why don't you just real quickly outline the five, from a high level perspective, and why don't you start there?
Yeah, so high level, and then we'll go into whatever you think's appropriate. But the five commonalities, and these apply to the extent that we've researched this, these apply universally. Number one is great people. You have to be able to fill your organization with great people. And that definition is different for every organization. But you have to understand what it is and be obsessed about people and getting that right. The second is an inspiring purpose. And I think so many organizations are so focused on external marketing that they forget to market internally to their team members and to help inspire and motivate people inside the company and help them connect to a bigger purpose. And so real quickly, kind of these two I think are important because we define great people, like most groups, as people that share your behavioral core values and fit the culture and who have the skills and the desire to perform their roles to a high standard. The challenge is I could come to work for a company and I could fit those two things, but if the company doesn't give me a reason to emotionally connect to what I do, it will be a transactional job for me. If they can help me create an emotional connection to the purpose behind my work, how I'm part of something bigger, I'll always bring more creativity and passion and energy to the work that I do. And that can transcend an entire organization. In the podcast we were talking about with the guy that was the basketball coach that does coaching now, you were talking about Anson Dorrance and the Carolina Tar Heels, the women's team, and all the success they had, and this time he gave them to make their stretching during warm-ups conversational and relaxed, and how that gave them this sense of unity and camaraderie that transcended the entire organization. And when he took that away to become more efficient, it actually worked against them. It's great people aligned and driven by an inspiring purpose. The third is optimized playbooks, giving them playbooks. And so I think we have to have SOPs and work instructions for initial onboarding and training. But once people are trained up in their roles, they still need playbooks to follow. They still need workflows to understand to make sure they don't skip steps. We as humans, it's our nature to take shortcuts, to find workarounds and find these shortcuts. But imagine if you've got a sales team with 20 people on it. They're all trained on the same sales book and it works well. It's designed well for the organization, but we don't have practice schedules. We don't have accountability to stay on process. You eventually have 20 people doing it 20 different ways and it creates utter chaos. And so we've got to have those playbooks and whatnot in that area. The fourth is a culture of performance. Which is really about clear expectations, letting people know how they're doing, good feedback systems, and a coaching system that will coach and develop people who are underperforming, but also has guardrails where people who are not coachable will eventually be coached out of the organization. So we're not tolerating mediocrity. So we've got to have a culture of performance that fits our culture and our values. And then lastly is growing profits and cash flow. That's the fifth and final obsession. And I often hear business coaches and people speak about profit and cash as the byproduct of doing other things well. And the more I bought into that early on and the more I've sat with that, I think it's intellectually lazy. Because if you believe in your purpose, the profit and the cash flow is what goes back into the engine to do more of that. And you'd be surprised how many people I talk to that can't explain their pricing strategy to me. They're not paying attention to cash conversion cycles. They don't understand the power of incremental change. They don't realize how when they give a 10% discount based on their gross margin, they will never generate enough new sales to make up for the cannibalization of gross profit dollars. Like that financial literacy, I find is lacking in lots of entrepreneurial organizations. And that's something that I think we have to be students of and we have to be attentive to. So high level, those are the five. And my philosophy is if an organization aspires to be excellent in those five areas, I don't care what system or what tools provide them what they need to get there. I want to be systems agnostic about that. I want to see them excel in those five areas because that's how the user gets the results they want and gets what we talk to as a return on life. And keeps it about the user, not the system.
Which one of those five is what you find is the most consistently difficult one to get towards?
So there are a few for different reasons. The culture of performance I find is difficult because emotionally it's hard to have tough conversations with people when they're underperforming. It's hard to hold people to a high standard and allow them to suffer the consequences if they're not coachable and if they're not able to level up. But what happens is that that causes this environment where we're tolerating mediocrity. There was Jordan Peterson was a speaker last year at the Genius Network annual event here in Phoenix. And I had a chance to attend that, and Joe Polish did a wonderful interview with him. And one of the things that Jordan Peterson said, and we now have this actually in all of our meeting rooms, this is a quote that's on the wall above one of the whiteboards, is enabling failure is not a noble cause. And if you think about that, oftentimes in our organizations, we enable people to fail and we don't help them. We don't support them. We don't coach them and develop them. And we also don't address the people who aren't coachable and who are the ones that are causing the problems. So that's one. But I also think the optimized playbooks, there's this dichotomy where people say that they're too busy to get their playbooks done and documented. But the challenge is the reason they're so busy is they're putting out fires that wouldn't exist if they had their playbooks done. Right. So there's a lot of that where we find early on with clients, we have to listen to these excuses and reasons and then help them see the lunacy of the position that they're taking. And so that's one of the early hurdles we have to kind of help people see. But the ones that do the work, the ones that really go after it, experience fantastic results.
Thank you. I think that was a great explanation. Thanks for explaining the challenges behind it. I love what you said, the lunacy. And it's so difficult, right? Because I'm sure like you, Michael, we work with so many different companies, different industries. We are not an expert in their business, unless we just happen to be the same business. I'm not going to know their business. And so you have to have this humility coming in of like, hey, look, I don't know what I don't know here. But there is this lunacy to the other side where they don't know what they don't know. Because often they've only worked in a business or two in their entire career. And so their insights are only within it and perhaps a few books, right? But they actually haven't seen or experienced it happening multiple different times. And so it is crazy, right? To be doing the same thing, not getting the results you expect and not changing from it. And that ultimately is, where that drives towards. And I think that's fascinating. So today when you're working, maybe I could just say from your own business today that you have, how are you measuring success with your business and with your clients?
As we work with our clients and they're building out their strategic visions, we use the BHAG concept from good to great. We refer to it as a summit. So we talk about growing a business is like climbing a mountain. So we refer to the summit of the mountain they're climbing. Oftentimes we set those closer to like 3 to 5 years out because I think business and the environment is changing so rapidly. Sometimes a 10 to 20 year vision is pretty pie in the sky. But really building out then, if we've got a 3 to 5 year vision, and we often use Cameron Herold's vivid vision as a precursor to lead in to help our visionaries really begin to articulate their vision, what does that 12 quarter or 20 quarter plan look like? And how are we progressing along the way? And are we actually achieving the things we set out to? So we measure success kind of two ways. We really want to understand what the founder or the owner ultimately wants in their life from and through their business. And you and I talked briefly before we started the podcast about this dance between optimizing the return on investment from your business, not at the expense of a return on life. And how do you balance those two things? And again, it's different for everybody. Some people define success as I want to exit in 6 years and I want to hit this number. And so, okay, we can engineer profitability strategy to get to a multiple, all the things that will affect getting that result. Other people want a consistently profitable business that gives them the freedom to spend 3 weeks in Europe over the summer. So it's a different definition for everybody. And I think that's also where if we show up and we've got one set of tools and that's all we can give you, it's very difficult for us to bend and flex to understanding you and what you really need and want, and if and how we can help you get there. And it's interesting because we really, even internally, we talk among the partners and guides, we refer not to a sales process, but to a confirmation process
Mm,
because we have finite capacity. And so if we're trying to sell somebody on our stuff and why they should work with us, we end up working with people who aren't really willing to do the work and who we may not really be able to help that well in reality. And we would rather reserve. So part of our whole flywheel model is based on a significant number of our clients come through referrals and word of mouth. So we have to pre-select and work with people who we are confident will do the work, because the only way we're going to achieve success is to do it together. And we can provide the guidance. We're the Sherpa helping them get up the mountain. But if they're not going to climb, if they're not going to use what we teach them and they're not going to take our guidance, they're not going to get up the mountain. So we have to almost kind of confirm with one another that we're a good fit, which is just also a different approach.
yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. It's been really fun listening and talking how many similarities that we do and how we approach. And I, of course, appreciate it from the aspect of being thoughtful. I love that concept that you were talking about of, hey, somebody's trying to get a certain multiple X to get to an outcome because they believe it's their retirement income effectively. And then you have other people where they're more looking for creating an oil well, right? Where they can be out of the business and be more like a shareholder, right? Within the organization. And as you said, there's no right or wrong in either one of those. And if you change your mind, it's okay too. What the key is building a great business to give you the options, right? Of going the direction. Because, Michael, I'm sure you've seen more than one. I know I have. 50% of these things, right, fail when you think you're going to sell anyway. So if you haven't built a sustainable long-term business, you might, first of all, it might not sell anyways, in this belief to get towards it. So yeah, this has been wonderful. So you obviously have continued to perform at a great level. You're helping other people perform at a great level. What habits have you developed on a personal basis, daily habits that you do to help make sure you're performing great work?
There are two really fundamental things that I try to look at on a daily basis whenever I encounter something that's not working the way I want it to. If it's relational with a person, that's a challenge for me. It goes back to expectations. I have come to find that the underlying cause of most of our frustrations with people is a byproduct of unclear expectations. And so I try to consistently think about, if it's something I'm delegating or something that someone else is in charge of doing, am I doing a good enough job of setting clear expectations and making sure I hear back from them that we're on the same page with those expectations? The other thing is, perhaps it's not people related, but it goes back to this quote. And I actually opened the new book with this. I've heard it attributed to Edwards Deming, but in my research, I found it to be a quote from a healthcare CEO named Paul Batalden, that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. If you want a better result, you need a different system or a better system. And so I've started really trying to look at anywhere we're not achieving what we need to. What's the underlying system and how does that system work? What are the components of that system that are causing that result? And what within that system can we modify to change the result we're getting? So it's allowing me to kind of clear a lot of the noise and clutter and focus on, do we have bilateral clear expectations, and are we focusing on system level improvements in everything that we're doing?
Well said. And I know you touched on it, but I just want to hit it again by asking more direct. So how you now measure success in your personal life?
In my personal life, so I'm not feeling it this week because I've got a hip replacement on Monday and everything is jammed into this week trying to get ready for that. But it's really it's a balance. I have not gone through strategic coach that Dan Sullivan created, but I have adopted some of the things I've learned through people who use strategic coach. So this whole idea of free days and buffer days and really kind of looking at my calendar and planning my calendar out in advance, where I time block for time that I can really kind of shut off and focus on time with my wife. We've got a granddaughter now in Michigan, our sons, and if I feel like I am balancing well the time in my life, I can measure that very easily through my stress levels. And when that's in balance, I feel successful. I've reached a point where I don't have the financial freedom I would like to, but I also don't have financial worry. And so I don't need to be in this endless pursuit of more. What I really need to, I'm 55 now. So is my wife. Like, we want to have time and quality. So it was also interesting in that podcast, the gentleman you were interviewing said you get quality time by having quantity of time and allowing the quality to naturally develop. And so it was interesting when I heard that, because I'm kind of parlaying that to how I look at my calendar, and am I creating enough quantity of time with the people I want to be able to have organic quality time bloom or blossom within that?
Well, once again, excellent answer. And clearly you've thought through this a lot, which I appreciate.
Sure.
Just one book. I know it's hard because you've read it. I loved all the books you've suggested throughout here. But if there's one, maybe perhaps there's one or two recent books, not one of your own, of course, that we would recommend people to buy. But what would you recommend to people in our audience?
It's interesting. So we've got a recommended reading list on our website of over 100 books that we've read and they're broken out by theme or concept. So it's easy to kind of go through there and find. But one that for the entrepreneur, him or herself, I think is helpful. And you may have read this. There's a book by Bob Buford called Halftime. And he was a very successful entrepreneur. And I think he was around 40 years old, maybe his early 40s, and his adult son, who was an Olympic swimmer, drowned in the Rio Grande. And he talked about this loss of his son as kind of forcing him into this halftime in his life, and how that affected the way he spent the second half of his life and what he wanted to do with it. And that book, as an entrepreneur myself, and I read it shortly after this devastation that I went through in my late 30s. And so I just really resonated with this idea of having somewhat of an obligation to take the second half of our careers and spend it using things from the first half that we learned in a way that we can give them back, which is kind of the premise of his story and his book. And so that was one for me, depending on the audience and where people are. I think that's one that is not often mentioned. And it's not a super well-known book, but it's a really, really powerful book and message.
How can people connect and learn more about what you're doing?
Yes, thank you. So our company website is nextlevelgrowth.com. There are currently 10 of us that are partners. All of us are former owners, CEOs, or presidents of businesses with at least 10 million in revenue, 50 or more employees. So we've lived it and done it. You can learn more about our approach there. The book is available on Amazon and Audible if you search 5 Obsessions of Elite Organizations, or you can go to the URL 5obsessions and link to it there. And then I've also created an AI clone of myself to be a companion to the book. The book is really much like Traction. It's a how-to manual of the foundational things that we teach. And that's why I designed the clone. I wanted something for people who wanted to do this themselves, or were smaller organizations that really can't afford a full-time engagement with a business guide, a way to get more insights and guidance than just the book itself. So that's askmichaelerath.com, but it's also available through the book.
Michael, thank you so much for being a guest on the Measure Success podcast today.
Carl, enjoyed it. You're a great interviewer. Had a great time. Thank you.
Thank you. And everyone else who's listening, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I encourage you to go out, go to the website, buy the new book that he's just recently launched in March of 2025. I'm looking forward to it. Michael said he's going to send me a signed copy of it. I'm looking forward to. And, but once again, what he's outlined today is exactly the type of principles you should be thinking about running it. If you're principle driven, you could help get to the outcomes that you're really trying to get towards, which you could apply to any situation. Michael, thank you so much once again. To everyone who's listening, thank you. Once again, thank you for your support. We just literally found out this morning that we became the number 4 strategic planning podcast. We're super ecstatic about that. Thank you for your support. And as you always like to say, wishing you the very best at measuring your success. Have a great day.